Tonight we're going to talk to David Zirin about his new book, The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee and Changing the World, which is a kind of oral history of the moment after Kaepernick first took the knee, and that tells the stories of some of the first high school, college, and professional athletes who followed his example. Reminder to everyone, you can keep up with Between the Lines events by checking the library's Facebook page or the library events calendar at we247.org. Tonight, I'm extremely excited to welcome David Zirin to Between the Lines. Dave is the sports editor for The Nation and writes the Edge of Sports blog. The Kaepernick Effect is, I believe, his 11th book. To ask Dave a question tonight, type your question in the chat on Zoom or as a comment on Facebook, and I'll ask Dave your question. Dave, thanks so much for visiting with us tonight. Can we start by asking you to tell us a little bit about the book and why you came to write it?
Well, first, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to everybody for watching and tuning in. This book, The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World. It's a Colin Kaepernick book that's not about Colin Kaepernick. Kaepernick's name is in the title. He's on the front of the book, but the book is really about the chain reaction, the effect that Colin Kaepernick had on communities large and small throughout the country when a prominent athlete in that community, from middle school through the professional level, took a knee during the national anthem to protest really the gap between what this nation promises and then the lived experience of far too many people who live in conditions of inequality, racism, marginalization, what have you. That's really the thrust of the book. But the idea for it really came from a conversation that I was having with 1968 Olympian John Carlos, who famously raised his fist on the medal stand in that Mexico City Games so many years ago. I wrote John's memoir with him, and so we've been very tight for 15 years. And John and I were talking, and he said to me, after I raised my fist in Mexico City, tons of young people, kids, when they were at athletic events, would be raising their fists too. And, I love history. I've read a ton about 1968. I'd never heard about young people raising fists at sporting events in big numbers before. So I was like, who were these people? What happened to them? Why didn't we take this seriously as social history? And it really made me think a lot about all the people that I'd read about and even some stories that I'd written about young people who had taken a knee during the anthem. And, I'd written some of these stories, but I would always write them as one-offs. Like, oh, here's a story about a football team where people threw garbage on them because they took a knee during the anthem. Here's a story about a cheerleader who took a knee and she was basically forced out of her school. Here, a story there. And so what I wanted to do was write something kind of holistic about the whole thing. Like, about what does it mean that we had hundreds, if not thousands, of young athletes take a knee during the anthem in this country between 2016 and today? What does that say? And can we preserve this as part of the history? Because I don't want in the future people to look back to this moment in sports and politics and see it as just Colin Kaepernick's moment. Because that's what we do with history. Partly because of our celebrity culture, partly because I think it's aimed at disempowering people from seeing themselves as active participants in history. But what we do is we hold up the charismatic individual and forget about the masses of people who made that individual's ascendancy possible. And so Colin Kaepernick is such a pivotal figure over the last 5-10 years, frankly, of the 21st century. But what these young people did should not be forgotten. So that was going to be the book. And then the summer of 2020 happened, a police murder of George Floyd, and you had the largest protests in the history of the United States. And I don't think we say that enough or really gather the implications of that. The summer 2020 protests during a pandemic had the largest protests in the history of the United States. And so at that point, I got on the phone because I'd interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of people who'd taken a knee, because that's what the book is. And it's their stories. And so I started calling them and finding out, well, how are you responding to this moment in the summer of 2020? What are you doing? And all of them were either marching in the streets or they were organizing people to march in the streets. And that made me really realize that while many roads may have led us to the summer of 2020, one of those roads runs straight through the athletic fields of the United States, where there has been an absolute overturning of accepted normality. And that's what I wanted to write about then. And that's really what the book is a testament to.
Yeah, it's interesting because I had a moment during the protests in 2020. I I can't remember if it was a news story but it just became clear to me that that Kaepernick was really, I mean in a lot of ways he was the start of all that, and it also, I mean it seems like he's going to, I mean, how do you think Kaepernick's going to be viewed in 20 years or 50 years? It seems like he's going to become like an Ali type character, or I
Well,
mean,
it's interesting. I mean, that's a great question. Let me get to that in 1 second.
okay.
First is like, it's like as far as like how this era has sparked off. I mean, certainly talking in the interviews I did, I think you get the answer, because for them, they weren't so much sparked by Colin Kaepernick as they were from the killing of Trayvon Martin, which, predates Kaepernick by 4 years, by George Zimmerman. And, for them, they were 10, 11 years old when that happened. So they come of age with this consciousness that not only was Trayvon Martin killed, but there was no justice. His life was treated as expendable by the justice system. It took massive protests just to get George Zimmerman arrested, and then the trial itself found not guilty. And when I talked to these young people, they spoke to me about what Trayvon Martin's death did to them in terms of how it motivated them and animated them. And I just realized, like, my God, they were like 9, 10, 11 years old when that happened. That's pretty unbelievable to have something that, I mean, there's no other word for it, but like traumatic happen and have that really seize a hold of you at such a young age. Like, what does that do to you? Like, it makes you feel like this is a system that needs to change, which a lot of these folks carried with them into playing sports and being good athletes. And at this point, they're looking for a kind of language by which they can express their dissent. And in Colin Kaepernick taking that knee, it was like, eureka, that's something I can do. So the taking of the knee becomes something that's like a language that they're going to adopt to express their level of protest. And that's what I saw when talking to people. It's like the political inspiration was rooted in what happened to Trayvon Martin. The tactical inspiration comes from Colin Kaepernick. And I really do hope that's how Colin Kaepernick's remembered in 10, 20 years, like someone who was part of sparking off and amplifying a social movement. I hope he's not remembered in some of the ways that people try to caricature him, as if he's somehow like against the troops or wasn't really that good a quarterback or whatever. And I think it's going to be interesting, the Ali comparison, because Ali, of course, became very beloved, but he only became beloved really after he lost his power of speech. Colin Kaepernick, largely silent for the last 4 years or so. He's about to break out of that and have like a Netflix special and other things. It's going to be a children's book even. It's going to be very interesting to see if the emergence of Colin Kaepernick's voice allows him to be re-embraced, or if it causes even more polarization because of people who have this visceral reaction to him.
Yeah, I saw that. I was surprised to see that on his. I was looking up. I looked at his website and saw he has like a 4-book deal with Scholastic or something, which is very, very interesting. That his voice will be out there for sure in the coming years. So in the intro of the book, you call Kaepernick introverted. Sorry to ask questions about the, about Kaepernick instead of the kids, but I'll get to the kids in a minute.
Oh, it's okay. We talk about Kaepernick as much as you want. I'm more than aware that this is a part of this story.
Yeah. So I was curious why you thought of him as introverted.
Oh, just because I'd met him several times and interviewed him, and he's shy. And I just think it's important for people to realize that, like, that Colin Kaepernick is not someone who put out a press release and said, I'm going to kneel during the anthem, or he didn't even put out a tweet. He didn't even kneel, for goodness sakes. He sat on the bench behind his team out of disgust, because it was August of 2016, and it was during that summer that you saw the police killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, and how those videos went viral. And there was a lot of protests that summer, and a lot of passion and a lot of anger. And Colin Kaepernick did not exist in this hermetically sealed cube away from all of that tumult. So it affected him. He sat down in disgust. And if it wasn't for a very intrepid reporter named Steve Weish making an absolute beeline for Colin Kaepernick and recognizing that there was a story there, and asking Colin Kaepernick why he did it, this might have been a 1-week thing. You and I wouldn't be having this conversation, and there would not have been that Kaepernick effect. But once the words got out into the atmosphere, people like Donald Trump saw it as an opportunity to demagogue against. Other people were inspired. And then Colin Kaepernick started hearing that he was doing it because he was somehow disrespecting the troops, even though it had nothing to do with the military. So he consulted a Green Beret, former Green Beret, and former NFL player named Nate Boyer, and asked Nate the question, like, what should I do? And it was Nate who said, well, how about you take a knee? Because then it'll look respectful, but at the same time, it'll also be showcasing your dissent. So they thought that was a good idea. And in a way, it's almost comical, because it's what a miscalculation. Like, they thought that taking a knee would actually calm the haters down, when all it did was enrage them all the more. And I think it enraged them because, you take that knee. I mean, you are making a very solemn, when other people are during the anthem have their hands on their hearts, or they're using the John, or they're going to get a beer, or they're sitting themselves just because they can't bring themselves to stand. Here's this football player, a black football player, a black quarterback, which has its own implications culturally, standing in front of his team and then going down to one knee. And, some people were deeply inspired by that. Others saw it as an unholy affront to the politics of sports, to the highly racialized authority that exists in the National Football League, to all sorts of issues that Colin Kaepernick started to pull the string unknowingly, I think, started to pull the string on the sweater. He's doing this because of racialized police violence, but these other questions get thrown up by him taking that knee about authority, about who has the right to be heard and who doesn't, especially in the football context. And that, I think, is what sent a lot of the shockwaves through people. That, and, honestly, because of Trump, I mean, good old fashioned racism, and using it as a political sort of cudgel, by which he used that very repeatedly and effectively throughout the campaign. Colin Kaepernick shouldn't live in this country. Colin Kaepernick, all sorts of other things that he said as well that don't need to be repeated. But the sum total of it was turning what could have been a 1-week story or a no-week story into a national phenomenon.
Yeah. You spoke to Steve Weish about that original NFL.com story when you were researching the book. I was interested in that because I remember, like when that story came out, I remember how it kind of blew up, and I remember thinking, and you probably thought this too, well, how did anyone even notice that he was sitting? But it didn't seem like a big deal to be sitting behind the bench, and so. But I don't think I really understood at that time that the way the story broke. And so after I read the book, I went back and read that Steve Weish story. And it really kind of lays it all out there. I mean, it really kind of, it's pretty inflammatory, the quotes from Kaepernick, I mean. And so I was just wondering, when you were talking to Weish, did you get the sense at all that, like, how much of this was intentional between him and Kaepernick, or how much was he being used as like a mouthpiece for Kaepernick, do you think? I'm just curious.
No, I know Steve. He's a reporter's reporter. in a journal, and he runs the straight and narrow. I mean, that's what you just described. Sounds like something I would do. But Steve, plays it very buttoned up.
Yeah,
So
so he just like hunted down. He just hunted down the story, and that's it.
Steve had known Colin since Colin was a quarterback at Nevada. Very not a strong or renowned football program by any stretch, but his athleticism just kind of leaped off the screen. And Steve, they'd had a relationship that charted back almost a decade. And Steve, like any good NFL reporter, follows the social media of the star players. And
Okay.
he noticed that Colin had posted a couple articles, intense articles about police violence in America and where it comes from and all the rest of it. And Steve, when he saw Colin sitting, even though Steve's been around football forever, and it's not that uncommon to see people sit during the anthem. People do tape on their ankles during the anthem. I mean, it's not that uncommon.
Yeah.
Steve saw Colin sitting with a towel over his head and just was like, I mean, the way he describes it's really interesting because it's like he's around a lot of other reporters and no one else is really noticing. Yet he knows there's a story there because he'd been following Colin's social. And had known him for so long. So he made a beeline.
Yeah, he had the sense that this is a guy who had something to say, and it turned out he was right, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and saw a story where his compadres did not.
All right, so I wanted to ask you about again and again in the book you talked about this a little bit, but you call Trayvon Martin, his generation's Emmett Till, and you say all these kids were so inspired by Trayvon Martin and that story, or really, the galvanizing effect he had on this generation. And I was wondering, why do you think Trayvon Martin had that effect and not other stories, or not other, not earlier killings, I guess? I mean, what was so important about? Do you think it was just the moment or the media coverage?
I mean, there's so much to say about that. I mean, I think seeing someone who was young, who was just watching the NBA All-Star game and went out during halftime to buy Skittles and Arizona iced tea. I mean, I think one thing is the details like that made him seem like very familiar, like somebody who they knew. And then the facets around the case, George Zimmerman calling 911 because there was a strange black kid in his neighborhood, and then having and being that racialized about it, and then having the 911 operator say, "Sir, please do not approach anybody, stay where you are," and then to have him ignore the 911 operator and go after him anyway, and to have it end with not only Trayvon dying, but there then were walkouts in something like 60 different South Florida high schools in protest of the fact that George Zimmerman was not being arrested. And part of that protest was, to me, a major turning point in the last 10-year story of sports and politics. And that's when LeBron James and Dwayne Wade got their Miami Heat teammates to all wear hoodies, because that was the other signifier of Trayvon that was used to say he was suspect somehow, was that he was wearing a hoodie, as if somehow that he traded in his ability to be alive because he was wearing a hoodie. So there was a thing where a lot of people were on social media wearing hoodies in protest of racial profiling. And so all of the Miami Heat posed in hoodies, photo taken, put on social media. It was really the first viral sports politics photo. And I think it led to a major turning point in LeBron James's own sense of strategy about how he was going to approach political questions and using social media, which he does with a lot of cleverness and a lot of political acumen, even if I don't always agree with him. And I respect how he's been able to manipulate the process to be somebody who can be, as he once said when he was 19 years old, his dream was to be a global icon like Muhammad Ali. and you see him trying to actually bend the entire NBA to be more political, especially on questions of racism and police violence. But to take it away from LeBron back to Trayvon Martin, and it's the Emmett Till comparison is the one that I go back to, because when you see videos like Eyes on the Prize or documentaries about the civil rights movement, they speak about Emmett Till in such intimate and personal terms as the reason why they got into the movement. And it was seeing Emmett Till, who, by the way, was also 14 years old, to have seen Emmett Till brutalized, lynched in Mississippi, and then to have his the damage that was done to his face and body put in national magazines at the request of his mother, so people could know what they did to her son. I mean, that was world-changing stuff. And it galvanized a new generation of civil rights activists. And that's what I felt with Trayvon Martin. I didn't think it before doing this book. I saw Trayvon's death as one of many tragedies that we've seen over the last 10 years involving racial violence. But for these young people, it did definitely hold a very particular and specific resonance.
Yeah, I always wondered, like when Tamir Rice was killed.
Yeah,
I think that was 2014, maybe. I can't remember the exact year, but I was working in East Cleveland, which is like a really poor community and suburb of Cleveland, still in the Cleveland suburbs. But to me, that I just saw so much of the kids I worked with in him, and
yeah,
I just wondered why. I always wondered why that story didn't resonate with people in the same way that the Trayvon Martin one did.
That's
because it's a horrible. I mean, you I'm sure you know the story. It's a terrible story, but I mean, and I think he's a 12-year-old kid,
12.
And he's just playing with a toy gun, and very anyway.
But stories
I don't
like
know.
this,
That's barely a question. So.
No, but I think it is true that stories like this, narratives like this, are what shape history, and history has the ability to have a kind of electroshock effect on different eras, where things that you thought would take years to accomplish in terms of consciousness or policy all of a sudden take weeks, if not days, because there's like this spasm that runs through the people. And I think the death of Tamir Rice, the death of Trayvon Martin, they do constitute a kind of whole that people saw themselves in. And that is a strong similarity between the two. But just like, otherwise these would be one-off cases and there might be one-off trials. But when you have story after story after story, and you have an absence of consequence for the police, that's where you get a Colin Kaepernick taking a knee out of frustration. And that's where you get this ripple effect of young people around the country, young athletes taking a knee as well, to express their dissent. And as I found doing this book, the real story really happens after they take that knee and they have to face the consequences thereof. How does their coach respond? How do their teammates respond? How does the community respond? What do you do if your coach supports you? What do you do if your coach stabs you in the back? What do you do if you get death threats? Someone joked with me that the title of the book should have been What to Expect When You're Protesting. Like what to expect when you're expecting. Because if you're thinking, I'm just telling you out there in Facebook land and in Zoom land, if you're thinking of doing a protest during the anthem and take a knee, you should read my book, because you will see every possible scenario of what could take place, and you could better prepare yourself.
Yeah. One thing is, if you're a high school kid who's going to protest, you can expect some pretty rotten behavior from adults in your life, I would say.
And one of the young people said to me this line, which I love. She said, adults used to tell me all the time that I was apathetic, and then they got even madder at me when I took a knee. It's like the only thing that I could do that was worse than not doing anything was doing something.
Yeah, I mean, there's a scene where like adults in the stands are spitting at kids who are protesting. I mean, I think, I don't know.
Unbelievable.
I think like now, like 5 years removed from this, like one thing we can take from this book, hopefully, is that adults can look back today and say, that we, like look at the adult behavior in the book with disgust, say adults shouldn't be spitting on kids.
I
I
don't
guess.
know.
I mean,
I'm
it's
looking at some of these school board meetings, and I wonder
well,
if instead these kids were really the canary in the coal mine, like warning us
yeah. So the
about clouds.
just last week, the library hosted a school board debate. Um, and it's interesting. I mean, and it's actually it's on the internet, and it didn't turn bad. It was everyone was very civil. I thought I would ask you about a question that was asked in the debate, though, because I thought you might have an interesting perspective on it, or certainly, you're not just a sports journalist, but you're kind of a progressive sports journalist. You're a lefty, as they say, and the question was: everyone leading up to the debate is very concerned about critical race theory and whether it should be taught in schools, and whether it has a place in, I don't know, high school curriculum. Um, and I mean, I had lead up questions for that, and I'm kind of just throwing it out there. But what I'm thinking is like, as pretend you're running for school board in northeast, in kind of suburban Northeast Ohio, and you get posed that question in a school board debate.
Do I
And
believe
obviously,
critical race theory should be taught in high school if I'm asked that question and I'm running for school board?
yeah, is that okay?
Sure. I mean, I would say two things. I would say, first of all, critical race theory is a legal doctrine that's taught in law schools. It's not being taught in any high schools. And if it was, the students are either prodigies or they wouldn't understand what the hell we were talking about. When people say
That's what
race
people
theory,
said that. People said
yeah,
that during
that's
the
correct. And
during the
then good
debate.
for them.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I would have the right, the best, the original answer. And the other thing I would say is, but when people talk about, oh, we don't want people teaching critical race theory, what they're really saying is they don't want teachers talking about racism systemically, as if it is a system, as if it is something baked into the cake of the United States. And on that question, I would say we owe it to our children to teach them the truth. And the truth is the transatlantic slave trade. The truth is the dispossession of Native American people. And the truth is that we need to reckon with this as a country because we never have. So let us be the first generation to reckon with the history of the United States in full. And that's what I would say. And if I don't get elected, heck with them, because if we're not teaching truth to our children, we're practicing a form of educational abuse.
Thank you. I think good answer.
Well, I probably wouldn't get elected, but that's what I would say.
You might. I think that's a good answer. I mean, it's a fair answer, and it's
I mean,
when you read some of the some of the things that adults do to kids in this book, like you've got I don't know, KKK Grand Wizard David Duke is tweeting out an image of a cheerleader.
A cheerleader in upstate New York.
Basically to intimidate her or whatever. I mean,
scare the crap out of her.
You would think that, I don't know, that there's a moment in time where people who are all worked up into a fit about all this stuff would say, okay, it's time to take a step back. This is a step too far. But
it's like,
it didn't really happen.
Yeah. No, it didn't really happen. And that's why I said, like, if you read this book, you're going to read more about, I think it's canary in the coal mine syndrome, where by taking a knee, and like I said, the stories in the book really start after the knee is taken. By taking a knee, they were able to peel back a layer of the onion on their own communities. You know, one of the things that people say, which is so untrue, which I always have to come back on, is they ask me a question about Colin Kaepernick polarizing America. And
Yeah.
the first thing I say is like, well, look, you know, Colin Kaepernick didn't polarize anything. You know, racism, police brutality, inequality, that's polarizing America, not Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, not protesting the polarization. But the other part of that answer, though, that needs to be said is that when you look at the polls and you look at this quote unquote polarization, it's really not polarization of America. It's polarization of white America. And I think that's one of the things that scared people so much about Colin taking that knee, is that he did push a lot of white folks to self-reflect, which you don't really want in this system if you want to uphold traditional norms of power. Because, and I say that because when you look at the polls, and I've done this, I've drilled down on them, the among Black, Latino communities, there's uniform support for Colin Kaepernick using his platform to speak out against racism. When you look among white respondents to these polls, it's like almost split. It's like 55-45 against Kaepernick, but that's still a substantial number of people who are thinking,
Yeah.
and supporting even. And I think that also scared them to a pretty big
So,
degree.
yeah. I wondered when you were reporting the book and you were looking back at some of these stories, like the university president in Iowa from the college section, who like threatens to kick kids off the football and cheerleading teams if they continue to kneel, or the dean at Kennesaw State. Is that what it was?
State, yeah.
I wonder, if you had the chance to talk to any of those kind of adult actors when you were reporting the book, and if they feel bad about, if they've changed their mind or changed their ways, or, and
I tried early on.
Maybe it's too early, but it seems like even now, so many people have changed their minds 5 years
True.
later.
And there is a story in the book by a woman named Mikhail Wright, who took a knee at UC Santa Barbara for basketball, and she talks about her former coach, emailing her years later after the killing of George Floyd, and really wrestling with it at that point, and the coach apologizing and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
Although it was kind of a weird apology. But still, it's like, so there's that instance. But in the other instances, I started with the book, I started early on reaching out to some of those folks that you describe, and they wouldn't talk to me. So I honestly gave up on it about a third of the way in. Like they just, and to me, by not talking about it, that to me says they're embarrassed and pretty uniformly kind of ashamed about the way they tried to bully kids. Instead of treating it, my friend Joe Ehrman, who used to play for the Baltimore Colts and he does coaching seminars, he likes to say that there are two kinds of coaches, the transactional and the transformational. And the transactional is you're into coaching because of what it does for you. The transformational is you're into coaching because you want to raise up young people and really help educate them through sports. And far too many coaches in this country, and this is reflected in the book, are in that transactional category. But if you call them on it, they're not going to defend it, and because that's the only real reason for why else would you Bigfoot a kid who's trying to, wrestle with the great social problems of their times. You do it because you don't want to be embarrassed, because you don't want it to look like you don't have control of your team, because you don't want to look like, as they like to say, the inmates are running the asylum, to quote the late Houston Texans. So, these are all factors in this that we need to take into account.
Yeah, you talk about one of those transformational coaches in the book, Coach Meyer.
Joshua
Meyer. And the player's name is Winston, I think. Or is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. I wonder. So he talks about. He talks about something like once you're awake and you see these things, you understand the world you exist in, and it loses its soul for you. And he's talking about college athletics losing its soul for him. Um, I'm wondering why don't more coaches in college athletics have that moment, have that kind of reckoning where they wake up, as Coach Meyer puts it. I'm thinking in particular, I mean, one thing that scene made me think of was, and I don't know if you remember this, you probably do, you're a sports writer, but the Maurice Clarett situation at Ohio
Oh,
State
sure.
10, 15
I've met
years
Maurice
ago.
before. He's a terrific guy.
Oh, really? Gosh,
Awesome guy. Like
I'd love to
top
meet Maurice.
5 people I've met in sports easily.
Did you meet him after after he did time and was doing the
This was like right before the pandemic.
Wow.
I keep a photo
That's
of it
awesome.
on my phone because he was such a cool guy.
Well, my favorite Ohio State player for sure. He's basically because he's a crazy good athlete. But I always felt like, Coach Tressel at that time, Maurice got kind of cast aside for basically selling his image and likeness, which is a whole big thing in college athletics today. And I always just wondered why he didn't defend him, why Tressel didn't have that kind of awakening that this isn't right moment.
Well,
But
I mean, this is, I mean, it's a sewer economy. It's incredibly wealthy coaches who do unspeakably immoral things to their players for the purposes of their own wealth, ego, and self-gratification. I mean, you talked about Josh Meyer. I mean, it's an interesting compare and contrast with another Meyer, Urban Meyer.
Yeah, it made me think of that too.
Yeah. And so, an Urban Meyer is in it for Urban Meyer, to put it mildly. And Josh Meyer is in it for the people and the kids. Now, who gets to be, it's a hell of a microcosm. Who gets to be successful in the profession? Who gets to make tens of millions of dollars? It's the Urban Meyers of this world, not the Josh Meyers. And, I think a more just society would reward the Josh Meyers and not the Urban Meyers.
Yeah. So, but there's no room basically for an Urban Meyer to have that awakening, or it's just not.
Well, it would be the equivalent.
Just because it's not, the economics aren't there.
Yeah, I mean, it would be like, over the last few years, I've read stories about police officers who start to think of their profession as something that is meant to hold up a racial hierarchy, so they've quit. It's not like there's space for them to speak about their theories of policing while also being a police officer. It's like once you're a coach who cares about your kids, you're no longer in line for a big college coaching job. There's one story in the book involving Mike Riley when he was the coach at Nebraska. And Mike Riley is very liberal politically. But when he had one of his players say, "I'm going to take a knee," and a couple other players are too, his response wasn't "if you do this, you're off this team." His response wasn't, "I'm going to stab you in the back." His response was like, "Rock and roll, go for it." But even that isn't the best response, because then you're also leaving your players alone on an island. When what Mike Riley should have done, I say from the convenience of my house, is turn it into an educational moment, put out a statement of support for the player, rallied the whole team around him, and turned it into an educational moment for the community and not let him sort of dangle.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was interesting about the, not to go back to the NFL.com article, but I thought that was interesting in that article that there was kind of a statement of support from the 49ers for Kaepernick in that, so, I mean, they started out at least supporting him in his, I don't know, self-expression.
Well, it certainly is the best team to be on. If you're going to do a protest like this, you probably want to be in the Bay Area.
Yeah, it's a pretty safe area too.
Buffalo. It would be a lot more difficult with the fan base and with the ownership group. So
I wanted to ask you about the intro to the college section of the book. You call the NCAA little more than a mechanism for the theft of Black wealth. I wanted to ask you to explain that a little bit. I
sure.
like it.
Sure. I mean, if you just break it down to what it is, the majority of college football players are Black. They are not paid for their labors. There have been some good reforms in recent years. The Black athlete and the body of the Black athlete is the foundation of college sports. And it shouldn't surprise us that college football is most prominent in this country in the former Jim Crow South, where you have, stands of people who support the racial hierarchies on display, where you have Black players, white coaches, white athletic directors. And what these white coaches make are they make millions of dollars, millions. And you have to ask yourself, if say a college coach made 1 million instead of $10 million, where would the rest of that wealth go? It would go to the players. And then it would go back into the communities of those players. And so that's why I said it's the mechanism for the organized theft of Black wealth, because there is so much wealth that's created in college football. I mean, it's like a tent pole of so many universities. And yet the people whose blood, sweat, and tears go into it don't see a dime from it. And I think they should be treated like the university employees that they are and be able to collectively bargain for decent wages and while going to class, if they so choose. There are all kinds of campus workers who go to class. They should be among their brethren. But instead you have a very different kind of system set up, and that's a problem to me.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. So I want to ask you a couple more questions about, just give you a chance to talk about Kaepernick, the person, a little bit, even though, as you said, the book's not about Kaepernick so much. It's about I mean,
the effect.
A lot of it's about the high school kids, pretty much.
Yeah,
which is cool.
High school and college kids, a couple of pros in there too.
Yeah, a couple pros in there too. Yeah. So Michael, there's a kid named Michael in the book. He's the quarterback at Lansing Catholic, who tells you this disturbing story about going to a classmate's house in grade school and having his classmate's father kick him out and say, "I told you not to bring those N words over here." When Michael takes a knee in protest in high school, the backlash includes like an adult lunging to attack him when he's on the way to the locker room. But something I was surprised by in his story is a little aside that he talked to Kaepernick over Skype. Kaepernick kind of called him in support.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, were you surprised to find Kaepernick being involved in the movement that way, like beyond his own actions? And are there other stories of him reaching out to support kids who are protesting along with him?
Yeah, there are some other stories of him reaching out. It's usually done very much in private. And then the stories come out later. I mean, it just fits with who he is and how he sees himself relative to the movement. Like, he doesn't see himself as some kind of mass leader or messiah or anything of that nature. He sees himself as really a drum major for justice, to use Dr. King's phrase. And so he likes to get in touch with some of the folks who've taken a knee just to let them know they're not alone, which is honestly one of the reasons I wrote the book, so they could get, the best part of doing this book has been mailing it out to the people I interviewed and getting their feedback. That's been the most rewarding part by far. I mean, rewarding because none of them hated it, but that's really important. But it just, they're proud to be in a book that celebrates what they did. But before I ever spoke to them, they had no regrets about what they did, no matter how hard it got.
Yeah, that kind of resonates like a drumbeat through the book. You ask everyone, at the end of their section if they have regrets, kind of.
Yeah.
None of them do. To a person, they say they don't regret it at all. So I was interested when one of the high school kids attends Colin Kaepernick's Know Your Rights camp. I wasn't aware that that existed. Um, can you explain what that is and what Colin's involvement in it is?
Yeah, the Know Your Rights camps or something that Colin Kaepernick put on. This is pre-pandemic, of course. It would be every few months he'd go to a city and there would be speakers and they would serve breakfast and lunch. It would be for several hundred kids from some at-risk schools, and it's pretty amazing. I mean, there would be lectures on nutrition, lectures on financial literacy, and lectures on politics and history, and lectures on what to do if you're stopped by police and knowing your rights. That's what the Know Your Rights camps were all about, and it was pretty amazing to see Kaepernick like interacts with the young people, and I mean he's very much like that type of person who wants to make sure that everybody knows where their box lunch is and everybody knows where to line up afterwards. Less than being like the big leader, in front of everybody. So it was a good experience to see. He would get these amazing lecturers to come in and talk to the kids, and it was special.
Yeah, cool.
Cool.
So I wanted to ask you about this idea. It's mentioned several times in the book. Kaepernick should stick to football, or like you hear LeBron should stick to basketball. You hear shut up and dribble. I'm a consumer of a fair amount of sports media, and this is something you hear quite a bit. I wanted to ask what you thought of, like where you think that comes from, and I wanted to ask, do you think it's better for athletes to build a bridge, as you say, or to pick a side?
It all depends on their own politics. I'm not putting out political prescriptions for these athletes. I'm just saying that you shouldn't have had to sign away your right to speech just because you're a professional athlete. So that's a part of it for me. I mean, it comes from their desire to control the brand, and athletes are seen, not heard, is one of the ways they want to do that. But what they can't do is silence the politics of athletes, because politics have been part of sports. When people say they don't want politics in sports, what they're really saying is they don't want a certain kind of politics in sports. They don't want politics that challenge racism, challenge sexism, challenge homophobia. They don't want politics that are about labor rights or anything like that. They're more than happy with politics if it's, hyper nationalism, militarism, and the like. And, so this is this battle between what politics will hold sway for the soul of sports is as old as sports itself, baked into the cake. It's like saying you love chocolate cake but hate chocolate. It's like the politics are there in sports everywhere you look. And so players trying to exercise that platform and that leverage to be political themselves, it's like they have every right to do so. In fact, that's one of the reasons that is often put forward to even understand what's happened in recent years, is that you can't disconnect it. All these athletes using their platform for political ends, excuse me, their platform for political ends is also because post 9/11, the atmosphere at stadiums got so politicized in terms of what people were being asked to support, that in terms of the war on terror and all the rest of it, and that it was only a matter of time before other people saw it as contested political territory worth challenging.
Yeah, you're right about that. The militarization of sports. Do you think that happened post 9/11?
It's always been there, but 9/11 shot it with a whole bunch of steroids.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got a couple more questions. One, I wanted to ask you. I'm going to scroll back to the top here because I forget the names. But you mentioned the guy who goes to Baldwin Wallace. He ends up student teaching at Medina High School, and my sister-in-law teaches at Medina High School. I grew up in Medina. And then another guy the first student in the high school section, he's engaging in this protest at Brunswick High School, which
Yep,
is also
Rodney
which is
Jackson.
one. Yeah, exactly. It's one town over from Medina, and so this may be a really short answer, but I was wondering, was there any coverage? And because I don't remember Brunswick or Medina being involved in this at all, and
A
I'm
little bit.
like, I read the Medina County Gazette every morning, growing up, and I was just wondering, was there coverage in the Gazette of it?
No, 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 no. It was
No.
more that it got picked up on social media and found it through their pictures and reactions
Oh yeah.
of that nature.
All right. Short answer. I had a feeling it might be, but I had to
No,
I had to wonder if you were looking at the Gazette's. I mean, I was just like, does the
no,
Gazette even have a website? How did he find
no,
this
no,
stuff?
no. Heard it through the grapevine.
Yeah. um, all right. So in the pro section of the book, you talk to Bruce Maxwell, the for the catcher for the Oakland A's, took a knee and got blackballed. And he clearly thinks that baseball is the most racist pro sport in America. He has some good reasons for thinking so. But I was wondering what you thought. It seems like there's racism in all sports, but is one more racist than the others?
No, I think they all have problems, and I'll just take Bruce at his word as someone who's lived it on this one. I'll defer to Bruce Maxwell.
To me, you don't have anything to say about football, huh? Because to me, it seems like there's more racist stuff that goes on in football. But
Totally. Well, it also
but
depends on football depends on a really strong sense of racial discipline where you have this contradiction built in the sport where the owners are almost entirely white, players are 70% are black, and they don't have guaranteed contracts and they're viewed as expendable, and it's the profits flow upward. And I think one of the reasons why there was such a visceral reaction to Colin Kaepernick is that he was challenging all of that.
yeah. All right. So I guess I want to make sure that I don't have any good ones sitting out, but I guess I don't. So there
Ah,
must be there must be some winners in here. I've got a whole long list of questions, but
I
that said, I'll just let you go instead.
with you.
So 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 what I've got here for a final question is, you've written all this about sports for all these years, and you're kind of focusing you're kind of focusing on, I don't know, the dark side of sport in America. Is that fair to say? And
Yeah,
or
sometimes, or at least the political side, I guess I'd say, because some of
the
it I see is, very positive.
Well, yeah, some of it. I mean, certainly some of the stuff in this book ends up having a very positive effect. But I'm wondering, thinking this way, writing this way about sports for so long, is it possible for you to continue to be just a fan of sports? Do you continue to be a fan? I guess, I mean, you're wearing the Ravens jersey right now.
Right. I'm going off to watch the baseball playoffs as soon as I'm done with here.
Oh, perfect. Me too.
Uh, yeah. No, I love sports. I just want it to be better. I'm not going to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I want to not reject sports, but reclaim it and challenge it to be better.
Yeah, cool. Good answer. Well, thank you very much for taking the time tonight, Dave, and
Thank you for having
good.
me.
You're welcome. Good luck with the rest of the book release. Hope it finds a wide readership, and
So, see, look,
and
I
have
got 4
have
cross.
fun. And is it Barcelona or Barcelona? I think you say it with the
Barcelona.
yeah.